The yellow rain jacket hung on the hook by the kitchen door, bright as a warning flag against the gray October morning. It was the kind of jacket you'd see from across a parking lot, unmistakable, the color of school buses and caution tape, cheerful even when the sky promised nothing but cold drizzle. On that Saturday morning in 2001, the air smelled like wet leaves and birthday cake, and the house on Maple Ridge still buzzed with the aftermath of a 7-year-old's party. Streamers drooped from the ceiling fans, twisting slowly in the breeze from the open window. Paper plates sat stacked by the sink, smeared with chocolate frosting. Red and blue balloons bobbed in the corner of the dining room, half deflated, their strings tangled, and Rebecca Lawson, 32 years old, dark-haired and quick to laugh, stood at the counter wiping frosting off the laminate surface with a damp cloth. Her movements automatic, her mind already running through the list of errands that needed doing before noon. Her sister Joanna leaned against the door frame, coffee mug in hand, asking if Rebecca wanted a refill. Rebecca shook her head, glancing at the clock above the stove. She had errands. The rental place needed the folding chairs back by noon, and she wanted to drop off thank you notes at the post office before the weekend rush hit. Her son, Owen, was sprawled on the living room floor with his new action figures, still wearing his paper birthday hat even though the party had ended 3 hours ago, oblivious to the fact that in less than an hour, his mother would walk out the front door and vanish for 12 years. Rebecca grabbed the yellow jacket from its hook. She pulled her dark hair into a loose ponytail, the kind that would slip free by mid-afternoon. She slipped her feet into white canvas sneakers, the kind with scuffed toes and fraying laces, worn soft from 100 Saturday errands, comfortable as slippers. The left shoe had a small ink stain near the heel where Owen had tested a marker the week before. Joanna called after her, something about dinner later that evening, maybe ordering pizza, and Rebecca waved without turning around, her keys already jangling in her hand. The screen door snapped shut behind her with its familiar metal click. The gray sedan in the driveway started on the second try, the engine coughing once before settling into a steady hum, and she backed out onto Maple Ridge, turned left toward town, and disappeared into a story no one could explain. Not the neighbors who saw her pass, waving absently as they raked leaves in their front yards. Not the postal clerk who never received those thank you notes. Not the woman at the rental shop who waited until closing time, annoyed but not yet worried. And not the investigators who would spend the next decade chasing shadows, searching woods, dragging ponds, and wondering how a mother could evaporate on an October morning in a town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were supposed to be impossible. If you've ever wondered how someone just disappears, how a life can unravel in the space between a birthday party and lunchtime, how the ordinary can turn impossible in the span of a single errand, stay with us. And if you're watching from somewhere far away or somewhere close to home, drop a comment and tell us where you're from. We'd love to hear from you, because this story starts in a small town in Pennsylvania, but it ends in a place nobody expected, and the yellow jacket that hung by the door would become the symbol of a mystery that refused to close. The first call came at 1:47 in the afternoon. Joanna stood in the Lawson kitchen with the corded phone pressed to her ear, asking a question she already knew the answer to. Did Rebecca stop by? No. Did she mention running late? No. The woman at the rental shop sounded annoyed, not concerned. The chairs were supposed to be back 2 hours ago, and if they weren't returned by closing at 5, there'd be a late fee. Joanna hung up and tried Rebecca's cell phone. It rang 4 times, then clicked to voicemail, Rebecca's recorded voice bright and apologetic. Hi, you've reached Rebecca. Leave a message. She tried again. Same result. The third time, the phone went straight to voicemail, as though the battery had died or the phone had been turned off. By 3 o'clock, the unease had taken shape, a cold weight settling in Joanna's chest. By 4, it had name and substance. Rebecca's husband, Alan, was out of town on a work trip, a conference in Chicago, unreachable until his flight landed that evening. Joanna drove the route Rebecca would have taken, slowly, scanning the shoulder for skid marks, broken glass, any sign of an accident that would make sense of the silence. Nothing. She pulled into the rental shop parking lot, circling twice. No gray sedan. She drove to the post office, the grocery store, the gas station on the edge of town where Rebecca sometimes stopped for coffee. At each location, she parked and walked inside. asking if anyone had seen a woman in a yellow rain jacket. No one had. At 5:32, as the autumn light began to fade and the streetlights flickered on, Joanna called the police. The officer who answered took her information with the kind of measured calm that only made the panic worse. Missing person reports required 24 hours unless there were signs of foul play or immediate danger. Was there? Joanna didn't know how to answer that. There were no signs of anything. No argument that morning. No strange phone calls. No money missing. Rebecca had been herself. Tired, maybe, but normal. That was the problem. The absence of signs was itself a sign, but of what? By the time Alan's plane touched down at 9:15 that night, the Lawson house had become the center of something formless and growing. Friends filled the kitchen, speaking in low voices, making coffee no one drank. Neighbors stood on the porch, asking if there was anything they could do, offering the kind of help that has no shape yet. Owen was asleep upstairs, unaware that his mother's absence had shifted from delay to crisis, from inconvenience to catastrophe. Alan walked through the front door expecting explanations and found only questions. Where did she say she was going? Did she seem upset? Had there been arguments, money problems, anything unusual in the past few weeks? He answered every question the same way. No, no, no. Rebecca was fine. They were fine. She was running errands. That's all. She'd be home any minute with some perfectly reasonable explanation, and they'd all laugh about the panic later. But midnight came, and Rebecca didn't. At 12:47 a.m., the police officially filed the missing person report. At 2:00 a.m., the first search team assembled in the high school parking lot, volunteers with flashlights and thermoses of coffee, organizing into groups, planning routes. At dawn, just as the October sun began to break over the hills east of town, they found Rebecca's car. It wasn't hidden, not exactly. It sat in the back corner of a hiking trailhead parking area, 9 miles outside town, tucked between a white pickup truck and a red SUV, easy to miss in the dim light of early morning. The gray sedan looked ordinary, unremarkable, just another vehicle in a lot frequented by weekend hikers and dog walkers. But when Deputy Lawrence Greer approached and shone his flashlight through the driver's side window, he saw Rebecca's purse on the floor of the passenger seat, and he knew they'd found something that would change everything and explain nothing. The doors were locked. The keys were gone. Inside, the rental shop receipt sat on the passenger seat, still crisp and unfolded. The timestamp reading 10:02 a.m. Rebecca's purse was in the footwell. Black leather, worn at the corners. Her wallet was inside, credit cards and driver's license intact. Her cell phone was there too, battery dead, the screen dark. There was no blood, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. The back seat was empty except for Owen's forgotten soccer ball. But on the driver's seat, placed carefully as though set down just moments before, sat a single white canvas sneaker, lace still tied, the small ink stain visible near the heel. The second sneaker was never found. The discovery of the car should have been a break, a crucial piece of evidence that would lead investigators in a clear direction. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. Why would Rebecca drive to a hiking trailhead? She wasn't a hiker. Alan confirmed it. Joanna confirmed it. Rebecca's idea of outdoor activity was gardening in the backyard. She'd never mentioned this trail, never packed hiking boots or water bottles or any of the gear people bring to places like this. And the trailhead wasn't on her way to anywhere. The rental shop was west of town. The post office was south. The trailhead was northeast, miles out of the way, accessible only by taking a specific turnoff from the county highway. You didn't end up here by accident. And why leave her purse but take her keys? Why remove one shoe? Greer stood beside the sedan as the sun climbed higher, warming the October air, and tried to construct a timeline that made sense. Rebecca left home around 10:20. The trailhead was 15 minutes away if you drove directly, maybe 20 with weekend traffic. If she'd driven straight here, she would have arrived before 10:45. But the rental shop expected her by noon, and she'd told Joanna she had multiple errands. Nothing fit. It was as though she'd been diverted mid-route, pulled off course by something urgent or someone compelling. But there was no evidence of either. Search and rescue teams arrived by mid-morning. Dogs picked up a faint scent near the trailhead parking lot, following it about 100 yards into the forest, before losing it completely near a rocky outcropping. Volunteers formed search lines and walked through dense underbrush, calling Rebecca's name until their voices went hoarse. listening for responses that never came. They searched for 3 days straight, then extended the search to a full week, then 2. They found remnants of old campsites, a rusted bicycle frame half buried in leaves, a pair of sunglasses with one lens missing, a weathered tent collapsed against a fallen tree, but nothing that belonged to Rebecca Lawson. On day 16, after covering over 40 square miles of forest and finding nothing, the active search was officially suspended. The case shifted from rescue to investigation, from hope to grim determination. Greer expanded the inquiry, pulling every thread he could find. He subpoenaed Rebecca's bank records. No unusual withdrawals, no secret accounts, no large purchases in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He pulled her credit card statements, gas, groceries, the occasional online purchase, nothing out of the ordinary. He reviewed her phone records, every call made and received in the past 6 months. Nothing to unfamiliar numbers. No patterns. No red flags. He interviewed her co-workers at the elementary school where she worked part-time as a teacher's aide. Everyone described her the same way: dependable, warm, devoted to her son, always the first to volunteer for school events. No one could imagine her leaving voluntarily, but if she hadn't left, where was she? And if someone had taken her, why was there no evidence, no witnesses, no ransom demand? Nothing. A tip came in about a man seen loitering near the trailhead that Saturday morning. Greer tracked him down within 48 hours. The man turned out to be a local birdwatcher, 73 years old, with an alibi confirmed by his wife and a car full of field guides and binoculars. Another caller claimed to have seen Rebecca at a highway rest stop 2 states away on Sunday morning. Greer and a deputy drove 6 hours, reviewed surveillance footage from the rest stop, and identified the woman. She wore a yellow jacket, but she was 20 years older than Rebecca, driving a blue pickup truck with Ohio plates. Another dead end. The months that followed were a study in slow erosion. Alan took emergency leave from work, then returned 2 weeks later because the bills didn't stop coming, and sitting at home staring at the walls was worse than the distraction of work. Owen started 2nd grade and asked, less and less often, when Mom was coming home. The school counselor called it healthy adjustment. Alan called it heartbreaking. Joanna organized candlelight vigils at the town square, printed thousands of flyers with Rebecca's photo, and maintained a tip line that rang constantly the first month, then sporadically, then barely at all. The yellow rain jacket still hung by the kitchen door, untouched, a bright and terrible reminder of the last ordinary morning, the last time everything was normal. Alan couldn't bring himself to move it, and eventually it became part of the landscape, invisible in its familiarity. Holidays arrived and passed with hollow ceremony. Owen's 8th birthday came in March. They had a small party, just family, and nobody mentioned that last year Rebecca had spent 3 days planning decorations. Thanksgiving was quiet. Christmas was worse. Presents opened without enthusiasm. Stockings hung but not filled. The calendar turned to 2002, and Rebecca's absence became part of the town's fabric. A permanent ache nobody talked about anymore, because talking changed nothing, and only reopened wounds that never quite healed. Alan tried to rebuild some version of normal life. He attended Owen's soccer games, helped with homework, learned to cook meals beyond frozen pizza, figured out how to braid hair for school picture day through a YouTube tutorial. But at night, after Owen was asleep, he sat in the living room in the dark and stared at the spot on the couch where Rebecca used to curl up with a book, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. And he wondered if he'd ever stop waiting for the sound of her key in the lock, her voice calling from the front hall. Joanna kept searching long after everyone else had given up. She contacted private investigators, most of whom took her money and produced nothing. She reached out to psychics, one of whom claimed Rebecca was in water, another who said she'd moved to Canada and started a new life. She joined online forums for families of missing persons and connected with amateur sleuths who ran true crime blogs and podcasts. A few were genuinely helpful, offering resources and emotional support. Most were thrill seekers looking for content. One private investigator, an older woman named Vivian Cross who had kind eyes and a reputation for closing cold cases, spent 6 months reviewing every piece of evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, following leads the police had dismissed. She came to the same conclusion Greer had reached. Rebecca Lawson had vanished without motive, method, or meaningful trace. It was as though she'd simply stopped existing at 10:20 a.m. on a Saturday morning in October. On the 2nd anniversary of the disappearance, Greer placed Rebecca's case file in a metal cabinet marked Cold Cases, Unsolved, and moved on to fresher emergencies. He didn't forget her. He thought about her often, especially when he drove past the trailhead on his way home from shifts that ran too long. But time is a limited resource in police work, and unsolved disappearances, tragic as they are, eventually yield to more immediate crises, to cases with leads and suspects and hope of resolution. Years stacked quietly, one on top of another, like sediment. Owen turned 10, then 12, then 15. He grew tall and serious, a boy shaped by absence, defined by the hole his mother had left. He didn't talk about her much, not because he didn't remember her. He remembered everything: the sound of her laugh, the way she sang off-key in the car, the cinnamon smell of her Saturday morning pancakes. But because remembering hurt in a way that never quite dulled, and talking about it meant watching other people become uncomfortable, offering platitudes that meant nothing. Alan remarried when Owen was 13. A gentle woman named Carla who taught history at the high school and understood that some doors in the heart stay permanently closed, not out of disrespect, but preservation. She never tried to replace Rebecca, never asked Alan to take down the photos, never suggested moving the yellow jacket. Joanna moved across the state for a job opportunity, but called every Sunday without fail. The house on Maple Ridge was sold when Owen left for college, but before they moved, Alan took the yellow jacket off its hook, folded it carefully, and packed it in a box marked Rebecca. And somewhere in the woods, in a place nobody was looking, the case everyone had given up on was waiting. In the summer of 2013, a property management company called Crestview Development purchased a tract of forested land 40 miles south of town, a parcel of over 300 acres that had once been privately owned by an elderly man named Harold Finch, who died 4 years earlier. Finch had been a recluse, and his property had been tangled in probate for years, the estate contested by distant relatives no one had known existed. When the legal battles finally settled and the land went to auction, Crestview bought it with plans to subdivide and develop, to turn wilderness into residential lots with mountain views and premium pricing. But first, they needed accurate surveys, boundary lines, topographical maps, all the paperwork required before breaking ground. In early September, a surveyor named Colin Blake was walking the southern boundary line with his equipment when he noticed something odd: a narrow dirt road, barely wider than a car, cutting through the trees at an angle that didn't match any property map he'd seen. The road was overgrown, choked with saplings and brush, but the path was still visible, 2 faint tire tracks disappearing into the forest. Curious, and with an hour to kill before his next appointment, Blake followed it. The road wound deeper into the woods for about half a mile, twisting around large oaks and pines, climbing a slight ridge, then descending into a natural hollow that formed a kind of hidden clearing. And in the center of that clearing, nearly swallowed by 12 years of unchecked growth, sat a gray sedan. Vines had climbed the doors. Saplings grew through the wheel wells. The windshield was crazed with cracks, opaque with dirt and pollen. But the shape was unmistakable, the vehicle clearly abandoned, left to rot in a place no casual hiker would ever stumble upon. Blake approached carefully, the way you approach something that doesn't belong, something that feels wrong even before you understand why. The vehicle was unlocked. The driver's side door groaned when he pulled it open, the hinges stiff with rust. The interior smelled like mildew and decay, like time compressed. The seats were mottled with mold. Leaves had drifted in through gaps in the weather stripping, forming small piles in the footwells. But clipped to the sun visor, faded but still legible, was a vehicle registration. The name read, Rebecca Ann Lawson. Blake pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. Greer arrived within 90 minutes, driving faster than he should have, his mind racing through possibilities. He'd retired from the sheriff's office 3 years earlier but still consulted on cold cases, and when the call came in about Rebecca Lawson's car, he'd been the first person they contacted. He stood at the edge of the clearing, older now, grayer, his knees complaining about the walk-in, and stared at the sedan as though it were a ghost made metal. The clearing was remote, accessible only by the hidden road Blake had stumbled upon, the kind of place you'd never find unless you knew exactly where to look or got impossibly lucky. How had Rebecca ended up here? Had she driven herself, pulled off the county highway onto a road she shouldn't have known existed? Or had someone brought the car here after the fact, staging a scene that made no sense? Greer circled the vehicle slowly, careful not to disturb potential evidence even after 12 years. The driver's side door hung slightly ajar, the way Blake had left it. Inside, vines had crept through the partially open windows, and small animals had clearly nested in the upholstery. But on the dashboard, placed side by side with deliberate care, sat a pair of white canvas sneakers. Both of them, laces tied, the small ink stain visible on the left heel. The forensic team arrived before sunset, 3 technicians with cameras and evidence bags and equipment for processing a scene that had been exposed to the elements for over a decade. They photographed every angle, documented the position of every item, dusted for fingerprints that had long since degraded. They searched the clearing meticulously, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, looking for disturbed soil, for graves, for any indication that this remote hollow had been the site of violence. They found none. The soil was undisturbed. The surrounding forest showed no signs of trauma. But in the trunk, wrapped carefully in a sealed plastic bag that had protected it from moisture and decay, they found Rebecca's car keys and a handwritten note. The note was brief, written in blue ink on a scrap of lined paper that looked like it had been torn from a spiral notebook. "Tell Owen I'm sorry. I had to go. Don't look for me." The handwriting, subjected to analysis over the following days, matched samples taken from Rebecca's home 12 years earlier. The ink composition was consistent with pens commonly available. There were no fingerprints on the paper other than Rebecca's own. The note was authentic. The discovery reignited the case like a match to dry tinder, but it also fractured the narrative everyone had been telling. If Rebecca had driven here herself, if she'd left the note voluntarily, then she hadn't been abducted or harmed. She'd walked away. But why? And where had she gone from this remote clearing 12 years ago? Alan, when Greer called to inform him, sat down on the porch steps of the house he now shared with Carla, and didn't speak for a full 10 minutes. Just sat holding the phone, breathing. Owen, now 19, and in his second year at Penn State, drove home the next day. He read the note once, slowly, his jaw tight, then folded it carefully and handed it back to Greer. "That's not her," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "She wouldn't do that to me." But the handwriting analysis said otherwise. Greer reopened the investigation with fresh urgency, assembling a new team, reviewing 12 years of dead ends with the perspective of hindsight. He re-interviewed everyone from the original case who was still available. Rebecca's former co-workers, most still at the same elementary school, repeated what they'd said before. She'd seemed normal. Maybe a little tired, but normal. Neighbors on Maple Ridge remembered nothing new. The birdwatcher had since passed away. Greer contacted the FBI, who added Rebecca to a national database of voluntary disappearances and missing persons. He sent the note to a forensic linguist at Penn State, who analyzed syntax, word choice, and phrasing patterns. The conclusion was maddeningly inconclusive. The note was consistent with Rebecca's writing style, but it lacked personal details or specific language that might confirm authenticity beyond the handwriting match. It could be genuine, or it could be carefully forged by someone who'd practiced. Greer pulled missing persons reports from the past 12 years, cross-referencing Jane Doe's and unidentified remains across Pennsylvania and 6 surrounding states. He looked for women matching Rebecca's description, her age, her dental records. He found 17 possibles. 16 were ruled out through DNA or other identification. The 17th had been cremated before family could be located, and no samples remained for testing. Dead ends. All of them. Then, in October 2013, exactly 12 years and 1 week after Rebecca vanished, a social worker named Lena Pritchard was conducting a routine home visit in a small rural town called Millbrook, 200 miles south of Rebecca's hometown. The case was straightforward. An elderly woman living alone, a neighbor had reported concerns about declining health and possible neglect. When Pritchard knocked on the door of the small, tidy house on Elm Street, it was answered by a younger woman, maybe mid-40s, with dark hair streaked with gray and tired eyes that seemed to hold decades of weight. She introduced herself as Anne. Just Anne. She was the elderly woman's caretaker, she explained, hired a few years back when Mrs. Callahan could no longer manage alone. They spoke for 20 minutes. Pritchard asked standard questions about meals, medications, living conditions. Anne answered everything politely, competently. but with a nervous energy that Pritchard couldn't quite place. She kept tugging her sleeves over her wrists. She glanced away when answering direct questions. She smiled, but it never quite reached her eyes. As Pritchard walked back to her car, something nagged at her, a persistent itch in her mind. The caretaker's voice, the way she'd stood in the doorway as though blocking entry, the nervous habit of touching her hair. Pritchard couldn't place it, but she felt absolutely certain she'd seen that woman before, or seen someone who looked very much like her. That night, Pritchard was scrolling through local news on her tablet when she saw an article about the discovery of Rebecca Lawson's car in the woods. The article included several photos: the sedan in the clearing, the white sneakers on the dashboard, and an age-progressed image of what Rebecca might look like 12 years later. The resemblance hit Pritchard like a physical blow. The shape of the face, the eyes, the way she stood. Pritchard stared at her screen for a full minute, then picked up her phone and called the sheriff's office. Greer and a deputy made the 200-mile drive the next morning, leaving before dawn, arriving in Millbrook just after 9. The house on Elm Street looked exactly like 1,000 other houses in rural Pennsylvania. Small, well-maintained, with lace curtains in the windows and a garden that needed autumn weeding. Greer knocked, his heart pounding harder than he'd expected, than he'd allow himself to admit. Footsteps inside. The door opened, and there, standing in the dim hallway, backlit by the morning sun filtering through the kitchen behind her, was Rebecca Lawson. She was older, thinner, her hair more gray than dark now, lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth. She wore a faded blue sweater and jeans, clothes that had been washed too many times. But it was her. Greer knew it instantly, knew it in his bones. He said her name. Rebecca. She nodded slowly. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." They sat in Mrs. Callahan's small living room, surrounded by doilies and old furniture and the smell of lavender sachets. The elderly woman was upstairs, asleep, unaware of the reunion unfolding in her living room. Rebecca's hands shook as she folded and unfolded a tissue, tearing it into smaller and smaller pieces. Greer asked the only question that mattered, the question that had haunted him for 12 years. Why? Rebecca's answer came slowly, haltingly, threaded with shame and exhaustion, and the kind of honesty that only comes when hiding is no longer possible. She'd been drowning. Not literally, but in every way that counted, every way that mattered. Postpartum depression had settled over her after Owen's birth like a heavy blanket, and it had never lifted. Not after a year, not after 5, not after 7. She'd hidden it well, smiled through it, kept moving because stopping meant admitting she was failing as a mother, failing as a wife, failing at the one thing she was supposed to be good at. She'd seen doctors. They'd given her medication that made her feel numb. She'd tried therapy, but talking about it only made the shame worse. By the time Owen turned 7, she'd been holding on by her fingernails, faking normalcy, performing motherhood while feeling like a fraud. The birthday party had been the breaking point. All those people, all those smiling faces, the noise and the expectations and the need to be cheerful and present when inside she felt like she was screaming. She'd woken up that Saturday morning and known, with absolute certainty, that she was ruining Owen's life just by existing, that he deserved better, that everyone would be better off if she just disappeared. She'd left to run errands because that's what the script called for. That's what a normal mother would do. But halfway to the rental shop, she'd pulled over on the shoulder of the county highway, hyperventilating, convinced she was having a heart attack. When she'd finally caught her breath, she'd seen a turnoff ahead, a narrow road she'd never noticed before. She'd taken it without thinking, just needing to be somewhere away, somewhere hidden. The road had led to a clearing, and she'd parked and sat there for hours, crying until she had no tears left, trying to talk herself into going home and failing. Then, late in the afternoon, an older woman had walked into the clearing, Mrs. Callahan. She'd been out for a walk, using the old logging roads as trails. She'd seen Rebecca's car, seen Rebecca inside, clearly in distress, and she'd knocked on the window. They'd talked. Mrs. Callahan had been a nurse once, before retirement, and she'd recognized the signs of severe depression immediately. She hadn't judged. She'd just offered kindness. A cup of tea, a place to sit that wasn't a car. No expectations. They'd driven to Mrs. Callahan's house in Millbrook, and Rebecca had stayed. For a day, she told herself, just to catch her breath. Then a week. Then a month. She'd written the note after the first week, intending to mail it, to offer some explanation, some apology, but shame had paralyzed her. How could she explain? How could she make anyone understand? The longer she stayed away, the harder it became to imagine facing Owen, facing Alan, facing Joanna and the town, and everyone she'd betrayed by leaving. She'd convinced herself they were better off without her, that Owen would heal faster with a clean break, that she was protecting him by staying gone. It was a lie she'd told herself for 12 years, and she'd almost believed it. Mrs. Callahan had needed help. She was aging, her health declining, and Rebecca had needed purpose, something to anchor her. It had been an arrangement that felt, at the time, like survival for both of them. Rebecca had taken the name Anne, paid under the table, stayed invisible. She'd followed Owen's life from a distance when she could, finding his school's website, seeing his name on honor rolls, his photo in a newspaper article about the soccer team. She'd missed everything that mattered: his childhood, his teenage years, his first heartbreak, his high school graduation. The life she'd thought she was saving him from by leaving had unfolded without her. And now, sitting in Mrs. Callahan's living room across from Greer, she understood with crushing clarity the magnitude of what she'd done. "I thought I was broken," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought leaving was the kindest thing I could do for him. I thought I was protecting him from me." Greer didn't arrest her. Voluntary disappearance isn't a crime, and punishing someone for the sin of mental illness felt pointless. But he asked if she was ready to go home. Rebecca looked at the white canvas sneakers Greer had brought with him, the ones from the dashboard, the physical proof of her flight, and she started to cry in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 12 years. The reunion happened 5 days later, after consultations with therapists and family counselors and carefully worded phone calls. It took place in a small conference room at the Millbrook Community Center, neutral ground chosen to ease the shock, to give everyone space to process. Owen arrived first, flanked by Alan and Carla. Joanna drove in that morning, her face a mask of emotions she couldn't name. Owen was quiet, braced, his shoulders tense, the way you brace for impact when you see the crash coming. He was 20 years old now, a man, not the 7-year-old boy who'd waved goodbye to his mother on a Saturday morning. When Rebecca walked in, escorted by a counselor, he didn't move. He just looked at her, really looked, seeing the years written on her face, the gray in her hair, the stranger she'd become. She said his name. "Owen." Her voice broke on the word. He nodded, just once. Acknowledgement without acceptance. She tried to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. Insufficient and far too late. She wanted to hug him, to bridge 12 years in a single embrace, but she stayed where she was, respecting the distance he needed. Owen finally spoke. "Why didn't you call?" The question was simple. The answer was impossible. "I thought you'd be better without me," Rebecca said. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But I didn't know how to come back." They talked for an hour, with long silences between sentences. Owen asked questions. Rebecca answered as honestly as she could. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, but his pain was evident in every word, every gesture. When the hour ended, he hugged her, briefly, mechanically, the kind of hug you give a distant relative at a funeral. Then he left. The weeks that followed were careful and complicated. A slow navigation of impossible terrain. Rebecca moved into a small apartment in Millbrook, giving everyone space to adjust, to process. She began intensive therapy, finally addressing the depression she'd run from for so long. Owen visited twice in the first month, both times brief, conversations stilted and painful. Alan was cordial but firm. He'd moved on, built a new life with Carla, and he wished Rebecca well, but he couldn't go backward. Joanna was the only one who cried when they reunited, hugging her sister with fierce intensity, angry and relieved in equal measure, asking over and over, "Why didn't you call? Why didn't you call?" Slowly, in increments measured in coffee shop meetings and tentative text messages, Rebecca and Owen built something new. It wasn't the relationship they'd lost. That was gone forever. A childhood erased by absence, a bond severed by time and choice. But it was real, fragile and honest, a connection forged in the aftermath of fracture. They met every few weeks, then every week. Rebecca attended Owen's college graduation when he finished his degree, sitting in the back row, crying quietly when his name was called. When he found her afterward in the crowd, he hugged her, genuinely this time, and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom." The word, Mom, was tentative, testing, but it was there. It was enough. Rebecca eventually became an advocate for maternal mental health, speaking at community centers and support groups about postpartum depression and the shame that silences it, the stigma that makes mothers feel like failures when they ask for help. She partnered with a nonprofit that trains first responders and social workers to recognize signs of crisis, the kind of signs she'd shown that October morning in 2001, signs that should have triggered intervention but didn't. She volunteers at a crisis hotline twice a week, answering calls from mothers drowning in the same darkness she'd known, offering the kindness and understanding she'd received from Mrs. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan, now 94 and in an assisted living facility, receives visits from Rebecca every Sunday. They have tea and talk about small things, and Rebecca thanks her every time for saving her life even though it meant losing 12 years of another. Owen keeps the white canvas sneakers on a shelf in his apartment, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. A reminder that people are more complicated than the stories we tell about them. That disappearance isn't always about villainy or victimhood, but sometimes about a kind of breaking that no one sees until it's too late. That mental illness doesn't care about love or responsibility or good intentions. And that coming back, even 12 years later, even when nothing can ever be the same, even when forgiveness is complicated and trust has to be rebuilt from nothing, still matters. The yellow rain jacket is packed away now, folded carefully in a box in Owen's closet. He can't wear it, can't look at it without feeling the weight of that October morning. But he can't throw it away either. It's evidence of a life interrupted, a family fractured, and a slow, painful healing that continues still. And every October, when the air smells like wet leaves and the sky promises cold drizzle, Owen thinks about his mother, about the woman who left and the woman who came back, and he's learning, slowly, to hold both truths at once. If you or someone you know is struggling with postpartum depression or thoughts of leaving, please reach out. The Postpartum Support International Helpline is available at 1-800-944-4773. You're not broken, you're not alone, and there is help.